Joining us via Skype to discuss this further is journalist Johnnu Miller. Now, Johnny, thank you for joining us. The EU foreign policy chief said that other than sanctions, other tactics will be used to build a complete strategy. Now, what other steps should we expect the EU foreign ministers to conjure up on this case?
Well, I don't think even they know at the moment. The only real pressure they can put on Russia at the moment is economic sanctions. But of course, they tried economic sanctions some time ago around the time of the MH17 air disaster, and those sanctions they put sanctions on Russia, and then Russia responded by refusing to buy any agricultural produce from the European Union, which of course damaged the European economy as well. At the time, you had a lot of criticism from European business leaders, particularly in Italy and Greece, who are already struggling economically, saying these sanctions are also hurting the European economy. And so now that with the EU threatening to put more sanctions on, there's even more people criticizing that potential decision within Europe. We've got the German economic minister, for example, came out yesterday and said, look, these sanctions, more sanctions on Russia is not going to change the political situation in Ukraine. It's not going to force Russia to change their stance. And indeed, it's only going to hurt our economy as well. So we may well see some kind of targeted sanctions against particular rebel leaders or particular people within Putin's government. But in terms of far-ranging economic sanctions against Russia, there's going to have to be a lot of debate about that, because it's also hurting the European economy as well.
And now, in relation to imposing sanctions on the separatists, with the conflict being on the road of escalation, are sanctions and further isolation of separatists going to contribute to that even more?
It's difficult to see what that will achieve. Sanctions on particular Russian separatist leaders isn't going to achieve very much. The recently elected leader of the Donetsk People's Republic is a former electrician. Putting sanctions on him, for example, isn't really going to achieve very much at all. So that's why the sanctions being discussed, it's more important to put the sanctions on the Russians, because of course it's the Russians who are helping the rebels, and it's those sanctions which are going to have more of an effect. But as I said before, European leaders are very reticent about doing that because they're only going to hurt their own economy as well.
So looking at the fighting in the east of Ukraine, it doesn't appear to be dimming down at all. So have any real hopes of a ceasefire been dashed altogether?
It's very depressing what's happening in the east now. When I was there, it's clear that the majority of people there just want peace. And it's very difficult to see which side, if any side, can actually win in the east. With the Russian support of the rebels, and it's almost sort of Russian pride at stake here as well. It's difficult to see the Ukrainians winning back this territory. And just as on the other hand, it's impossible to see the rebels advancing too much further. So this breaking of the ceasefire, which has been going on for weeks now, hundreds of people have been killed when the ceasefire has actually been in place. And now the ceasefire looks like completely breaking. It looks like many more people are going to be killed. And it's difficult to see either side making any real tangible gains. Now,
just looking at the Europe's stance on all of this, they're calling the east of Ukraine's vote illegal, but they're not condemning Kiev authorities for placing Donetsk and Kiev under siege, are they?
No, exactly. I mean, what we have here in Ukraine is a battle between the Kiev government and the rebels, but it's also in some respect, a proxy war between the West and Russia. These sanctions that have been put on Russia, it's not just about Ukraine, it's also about American geopolitics wanting to contain Russia. So in terms of this conflict, it's not just a matter of what the Kiev government do or the rebels do, it's about what the Americans decide and what the Russians decide at a higher level.
You mentioned Russian pride and the possibility that Ukraine will not win back this territory. How do you see this all planning out?
Well, it's different. I mean, in the short term, it looks like the ceasefire is ending. As I said, there's been a ceasefire in place, but there's been fighting on both sides. Now, the rebels, just before the ceasefire was announced, it was the rebels, which surprised many, it was the rebels who were making territorial gains. And now we have reports that the rebels are far better armed. They have a lot of volunteers, as they're called, from Russia. So they've been able to reinforce their positions. So as I said, it's difficult to see any side winning. But this conflict is going to carry on until there's a decision made at the higher levels between the Russians, between the Americans and the Europeans to start talking and working together on this. If not, we're just going to have more people dying in Ukraine and no end to this conflict.
But do you think that the EU and the US will be prepared to speak with Russia? To have Russia at the table?
Well, at the moment, we've just had the G20 summit in Brisbane in Australia, and Putin left that summit. A lot of the Western leaders attacked Putin, and a lot in the media around the world, you'll see a lot of criticism of the Russians. It's the Russians that are interfering in the East, and of course they are. But of course, we also have to look at the fact that it was Western countries which helped start the coup in Kiev to start with. So we have to criticize Western countries as well for starting all this, if you like. So criticism has to be put on both sides, and both sides need to talk rather than just accusing each other of starting this whole thing and interfering in the country.
Johnnu Miller, thank you very much for joining us.